We're often told that the economy is this insanely complicated thing, right? Something that only the experts could possibly understand. But what if that's just not true? What if it's actually a pretty simple machine, driven by just a few key parts and, well, predictable human nature? Let's break it down and see if we can build a model of how it all works.
And that's the core idea from investor Ray Dalio. The whole point here is to demystify it, to understand the simple mechanics that drive literally everything, from your weekly grocery run all the way to a global financial crisis.
And it really all boils down to these three forces. Seriously, just think of them as gears inside the machine. First, you've got the slow, steady grind of productivity growth. Then you layer two debt cycles on top of that. One's short and fast, and the other is huge and slow. If you can get how these three interact, you've pretty much cracked the code.
All right, so to build this machine, we've got to start from the ground up. I mean, with the smallest possible piece, the absolute atom of the whole thing.
And that's a transaction. It is really that simple. I mean, you do this constantly without even thinking about it. Every time you buy a coffee or pay a bill, that's a transaction. It's just a buyer handing over money or credit to a seller for something. That is the bedrock of everything.
And here's the wild part. The entire massive global economy, it's literally just the sum total of all of those simple transactions. That's it. Every market in the world is just a collection of these simple exchanges.
Okay, so if transactions are the building blocks, then credit is like the rocket fuel. It's the volatile, high-octane stuff that makes the machine really go. It's also the biggest, most important, and maybe the most misunderstood part of this entire system.
So what's the actual difference between money and credit? Well, think of it this way. When you use cash to buy a drink, boom, the transaction is over. It's settled. But when you use credit, like saying put it on my tab, you've created a promise to pay later. You've created an asset for the bartender, your tab, and a liability for yourself, which is debt. You've essentially created credit out of thin air.
And the scale of this is just mind-blowing. In the U.S. economy, for example, there's about $50 trillion in credit floating around, compared to only about $3 trillion in actual money. That tells you everything you need to know. Credit absolutely dwarfs cash, and that's why it's the real driver of the economic swings we all feel. Now, if there is one sentence you remember from all of this, let it be this one. One person's spending is another person's income. Just let that sink in for a second. Every dollar you spend becomes income for somebody else. And that simple little feedback loop, that is the absolute key to how these cycles get created.
So let's watch how this actually builds on itself. Imagine you borrow money so you can spend more than you earn. Well, that extra spending becomes someone else's income. Now they have a higher income, which makes them look more creditworthy, right? So they can borrow more and spend more. And their spending, well, that becomes income for yet another person. And the cycle just keeps feeding on itself, pushing economic growth up and up.
Okay, so now we have all the pieces. Let's put the whole model together. We're going to take those three main forces we talked about at the beginning and layer them on top of each other.
First, you've got the foundation. This is productivity growth. You can just picture it as this pretty straight line always heading steadily upwards. This is our accumulated knowledge, our innovation, our hard work. It doesn't really jump around much, but over the long run, it's the only thing that truly matters for improving our standard of living.
Now we overlay the wiggles. This is the short-term debt cycle. This is the one we always hear about on the news. Expansions and recessions. It usually lasts about 5 to 8 years. When credit is cheap and easy to get, we get a boom. But then spending gets too hot and causes inflation, so the central bank raises interest rates. Credit gets expensive, and we get a recession. Then they lower rates again, and the whole thing starts over.
But here's the kicker. When you zoom way out and look at this over many decades, you start to see something else. Each little cycle ends with a bit more debt than the last one. And why does that happen? Well, it's human nature. We tend to want to borrow and spend more rather than pay back debt. And over 75 to 100 years, this behavior creates a massive, long-term debt cycle.
And eventually, you reach a tipping point. Debt repayments start growing faster than incomes, and that whole self-reinforcing pattern we talked about slams into reverse. The debt burdens just become unmanageable. And this isn't some abstract theory. This is exactly what led to the Great Depression in 1929 and the global financial crisis in 2008.
So when that long-term cycle finally peaks, the economy has to go through a phase called a deleveraging. And yeah, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's the painful but totally necessary process of bringing all those debt burdens back down.
So what makes a deleveraging so different from a regular recession?
Well, in a typical recession, the central bank can just lower interest rates to get people borrowing and spending again. But here's the problem. In a deleveraging, interest rates are already at or near zero. You can't cut them any further. That main tool in the toolbox is completely gone.
So policymakers are left with four main levers to pull. You can cut spending, which is austerity, but that's painful and actually lowers incomes. You can reduce debt through defaults and bankruptcies, but that destroys people's wealth. You can redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor, but that often creates a lot of social tension. And finally, you can print money.
The real key is balance. You have to mix the painful deflationary options like austerity and defaults with the inflationary stimulative option of printing money. It's a really tough balancing act, but if policymakers can get that mix right, they can achieve what Dalio calls a beautiful deleveraging, where you bring down the debt without completely crashing the economy.
So after all of that, how can we boil this entire model down into just a few simple takeaways? Well, here are 3 rules of thumb to help guide you, whether you're thinking about your own finances or the economy as a whole.
First, and this is the big one, don't let your debt grow faster than your income. Because if you do, your debt burdens are eventually going to become unsustainable and they will crush you. This is the core lesson of that long-term debt cycle.
Second, don't have your income rise faster than your productivity. I mean, if you're making more money without actually producing more value, you're eventually going to become uncompetitive. And that's true for a person, a company, or a whole country.
And that leads right into the final and maybe most important rule. Do everything you can to raise your productivity. Because in the long run, after all the cycles have come and gone, that's what truly matters. That is what creates prosperity.
So, what we have here is a simple template, a kind of map for understanding the economy. And that leaves us with one final question, and this one is for you. Looking at the world today through this lens, where do you think we are now in that long-term debt cycle?